June 12, 1987. Mikhail Gorbachev was in his office in the Kremlin, reviewing documents related to the upcoming Central Committee plenum, when his assistant knocked on the door and entered with unusual urgency. "Comrade General Secretary," the assistant said, "Reagan is giving a speech in Berlin, at the Brandenburg Gate. Our embassy says it's significant. They're transmitting the text now." Gorbachev looked up from his papers, his reading glasses perched on his nose. He was 56 years old, younger and more energetic than the succession of elderly, dying Soviet leaders who had preceded him: Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko. Since becoming General Secretary in 1985, Gorbachev had been trying to reform the Soviet system through his policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He had met with Reagan twice, in Geneva in 1985 and in Reykjavik in 1986. And while the meetings had been tense and often contentious, Gorbachev had developed a grudging respect for the American president. But Reagan remained fundamentally opposed to the Soviet system, and Gorbachev knew it. The question was, what would Reagan say in Berlin, the divided city that symbolized the Cold War more than any other place on earth? "Put it on the television," Gorbachev said, removing his glasses. "Let's see what the American president has to say." The assistant turned on the television in Gorbachev's office, switching to the channel that carried international news feeds. The image was grainy, the signal coming from West Berlin via satellite, but clear enough. There was Ronald Reagan standing at a podium in front of the Brandenburg Gate, the famous neoclassical monument that stood just inside East Berlin, visible from the west but inaccessible, separated by the concrete barrier of the Berlin Wall. Behind Reagan, Gorbachev could see the wall itself, grey, ugly, topped with barbed wire, a monument to division and oppression, and beyond it, East German guards watching from their towers, making sure no one tried to escape from the workers' paradise to the capitalist West. Reagan began speaking, his voice strong and clear despite his 76 years. Gorbachev leaned forward, listening intently. His English was limited, but good enough to follow the speech, and besides, the Kremlin translators would provide a full transcript within the hour. Reagan talked about the history of Berlin, about the airlift in 1948, when the Soviets had tried to starve the city into submission, and the Americans had responded with a massive relief operation. He talked about freedom and prosperity in West Berlin, contrasting it with the poverty and oppression of East Berlin. He talked about the Berlin Wall as a symbol of communist failure. Gorbachev's expression remained neutral, but inside he felt a familiar frustration. Here was Reagan again, using Cold War rhetoric, talking about communism versus freedom, refusing to acknowledge the progress that Gorbachev was trying to make in reforming the Soviet system. But then Reagan said something that made Gorbachev sit up straighter in his chair. "General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate." Reagan paused for dramatic effect, and Gorbachev could see the crowd behind him, thousands of West Berliners, Americans, tourists, waiting to hear what came next. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." The crowd erupted in cheers. Reagan repeated it, his voice rising. "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Gorbachev stared at the television screen, his face unreadable. Then he stood up abruptly and walked to the window of his office, looking out over the Kremlin complex, over Moscow, over the vast Soviet empire that he was trying desperately to reform and preserve. His assistant stood uncertainly by the television, not sure whether to turn it off or let it continue. Finally, Gorbachev spoke, his voice quiet but intense. "Does he think it's that simple? Does Reagan actually believe I can just order the wall torn down, just like that, and it will happen?" The assistant said nothing. These were rhetorical questions, and he knew better than to answer them. Gorbachev turned back from the window, his face showing the strain of the impossible position he found himself in. The wall. Always the wall, as if everything about the Cold War, everything about East-West relations, everything about 40 years of history can be reduced to that one concrete barrier in Berlin. He walked back to his desk and sat down heavily. "Get me the full transcript as soon as it's ready, and I want a meeting with Shevardnadze, Yakovlev, and Chernyaev this afternoon. We need to discuss how to respond to this." After his assistant left, Gorbachev sat alone in his office, thinking about Reagan's challenge. Tear down this wall. As if it were a simple matter of construction and demolition, as if the Berlin Wall were just a physical structure rather than a symbol of the entire post-war European order, of Soviet security concerns, of the division of Germany and Europe that had kept the peace, however tense and uneasy, for more than 40 years. But Gorbachev also knew that Reagan had touched on something real. The Berlin Wall was an embarrassment. It was a visible, undeniable symbol of the fact that people were trying to escape from communist East Germany to capitalist West Germany, not the other way around. It was a monument to the failure of the socialist system to provide the prosperity and freedom it had promised. And Gorbachev, unlike his predecessors, was willing to acknowledge that failure, at least privately. That's why he had launched Glasnost and Perestroika. That's why he was trying to reform the Soviet economy, liberalize Soviet politics, reduce military spending, improve relations with the West. He knew the system wasn't working. He knew it needed fundamental change. But tearing down the Berlin Wall? That was something else entirely. That would mean acknowledging that the division of Germany was unsustainable, that the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe was crumbling, that the entire structure of post-war European security was collapsing. And Gorbachev wasn't ready to go that far. Not yet. Later that afternoon, Gorbachev met with his closest advisors in his Kremlin office, Eduard Shevardnadze, the foreign minister, Alexander Yakovlev, the architect of Glasnost, and Anatoly Chernyaev, Gorbachev's foreign policy aide and confidant. "Well, gentlemen," Gorbachev said as they settled into their chairs, "you've all seen or heard about Reagan's speech in Berlin. What do we make of it?" Shevardnadze spoke first. "It's classic Reagan, dramatic, theatrical, designed for television. He's speaking to domestic audiences, trying to look tough on communism, but substantively it doesn't change anything. He knows we're not going to tear down the Berlin Wall just because he demands it. But that's not really the point, is it?" Yakovlev interjected. "The point is that he's put us on the defensive again. He's made us look like the oppressors, the ones keeping Germany divided, the ones maintaining the wall. And the worst part is, he's right. The wall is indefensible morally. We built it to keep our own people from leaving. That's not a sign of strength. It's a sign of weakness." Gorbachev nodded slowly. "Alexander's right. The wall is a problem, not just because Reagan is making speeches about it. It's a problem because it represents everything that's wrong with our system. The need to use force to keep people from leaving, the fear of our own citizens choosing freedom over socialism." Chernyaev, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Comrade General Secretary, we need to think strategically about this. Reagan is near the end of his presidency. He's already served more than 6 years, and he'll be out of office in less than 2 years. This speech is part of his legacy building, his attempt to cement his reputation as the president who stood up to the Soviet Union. But," Chernyaev continued, "it's also a challenge to you personally. He's calling you out by name, demanding that you take action. If you do nothing, it looks like weakness. If you respond angrily, it looks like you're defensive. If you actually did tear down the wall, which I'm not suggesting, it would be seen as capitulation to American pressure." Gorbachev stood and began pacing, a habit he had developed during long Politburo meetings. "So what do we do? How do we respond?" "We don't," Shevardnadze said firmly. "We don't give Reagan the satisfaction of a response. We let the speech fade away, become just another piece of Cold War rhetoric. We continue with our reforms, continue with Glasnost and Perestroika, continue trying to improve relations with the West, but we do it on our own timeline, for our own reasons, not because Reagan demands it. I disagree, Yakovlev said. We should respond, but not in the way Reagan expects. We should acknowledge that the division of Europe is a problem, that we're working on it through reform and dialogue. We should turn Reagan's challenge into an opportunity to showcase our reform efforts, to show that we're already moving in the direction of greater openness and freedom. Gorbachev stopped pacing and looked at his advisors. These were the men he trusted most, the reformers who shared his vision of a different kind of Soviet Union. Still socialist, still powerful, but more open, more humane, more responsive to its people's needs. But even among reformers, there were limits. Tearing down the Berlin Wall would mean the end of East Germany as a separate state. It would mean the reunification of Germany, which would shift the balance of power in Europe. It would mean the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the end of the Soviet security buffer in Eastern Europe. It would mean, in effect, admitting that the Soviet Union had lost the Cold War. And Gorbachev, for all his reformist instincts, wasn't ready to admit that. Not in 1987. Here's what we'll do, Gorbachev said finally. We'll issue a brief statement through TASS saying that Reagan's speech is unhelpful to the cause of improving East-West relations, that theatrical gestures are no substitute for serious diplomacy, and that we remain committed to dialogue and arms control. Nothing more. And privately, he continued, we continue with our reforms. We continue opening up Soviet society. We continue reducing military tensions. We continue working toward better relations with the West. But we do it because it's right for the Soviet Union, not because Reagan demands it. The advisors nodded and the meeting broke up. But after they left, Chernyaev lingered for a moment. Mikhail Sergeyevich, he said quietly, using Gorbachev's patronymic in the informal Russian style. May I speak frankly? You always do, Anatoly, Gorbachev said with a slight smile. Reagan is right about the wall. It is an obscenity. It does represent everything wrong with the old system, and sooner or later it's going to come down. The only question is whether it comes down in an orderly way, under our control, or whether it comes down chaotically in a way that destabilizes everything. Gorbachev looked at his aide for a long moment. I know, he said quietly. I know, but the timing has to be right. The political conditions have to be right. If I move too fast, if I push too hard for change, the hardliners in the Politburo will remove me. And then all the reforms will stop and will go back to the Brezhnev era of stagnation, or worse. So I have to move carefully, Gorbachev continued. I have to reform the system from within, gradually, step by step. And yes, eventually the wall will come down, but it has to happen as part of a broader process of change, not as a dramatic gesture in response to an American president's speech. Chernyaev nodded. I understand, but Mikhail Sergeyevich, be aware that events may move faster than you expect. Once you start liberalizing, once you allow people to speak freely and think freely, you can't always control where it leads. The wall may come down whether you're ready for it or not. After Chernyaev left, Gorbachev sat alone in his office again, thinking about Reagan's challenge. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It sounded so simple, so straightforward. But nothing about the Cold War was simple or straightforward. Gorbachev had inherited a Soviet Union that was economically stagnant, militarily overextended, and ideologically exhausted. The Brezhnev era had been characterized by stability and stagnation. No purges, no upheavals, but also no growth, no innovation, no progress. The Soviet economy was falling further and further behind the West. The war in Afghanistan was draining resources and morale. The nuclear arms race was bankrupting the country, and so Gorbachev had launched his reforms. Glasnost, allowing people to speak more freely, to criticize the government, to discuss problems openly. Perestroika, restructuring the economy, introducing limited market mechanisms, trying to make Soviet industry more efficient and competitive. And in foreign policy, trying to reduce tensions with the West, to cut military spending, to end the Cold War confrontation that was consuming so many resources. But reform was dangerous. Every step toward liberalization created pressure for more liberalization. Every acknowledgement of past mistakes encouraged people to question the entire system. Every reduction in censorship allowed more criticism of the government. Gorbachev was trying to reform communism, to make it work better. But what if communism couldn't be reformed? What if the whole system was fundamentally flawed and needed to be replaced rather than repaired? These were dangerous thoughts, and Gorbachev tried not to think them too often. He was a communist, a true believer in socialist ideals, even if he recognized that the Soviet system had strayed from those ideals. He wanted to save communism, not destroy it. He wanted to prove that socialism could be democratic, humane, and prosperous. But the Berlin Wall stood as a rebuke to all of that. You couldn't claim your system was better if you had to build walls to keep people from leaving. You couldn't claim your ideology was superior if people risked their lives to escape it. The wall was a daily reminder that something was fundamentally wrong. That evening, Gorbachev had dinner with his wife Raisa in their private apartment in the Kremlin. Raisa was his closest confidant, his intellectual equal, and often his political advisor. Unlike the wives of previous Soviet leaders, who had stayed in the background, Raisa was visible and active, accompanying Gorbachev on foreign trips, speaking publicly about social issues, presenting a modern face of Soviet leadership. "You seem troubled, Misha," Raisa said, using her pet name for him. "Is it Reagan's speech?" Gorbachev nodded. "He's challenging me directly. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." "As if I'm personally responsible for the wall, as if I built it myself." "Aren't you responsible, in a sense?" Raisa asked gently. "You're the leader of the Soviet Union. The wall exists because the Soviet Union wants it to exist. If you wanted it torn down, it would be torn down." "It's not that simple," Gorbachev said, frustration evident in his voice. "The wall is part of the entire structure of post-war Europe. It's tied to the division of Germany, to the existence of East Germany as a separate state, to our security arrangements in Eastern Europe. If the wall comes down, all of that starts to unravel." "And would that be so terrible?" Raisa asked quietly. Gorbachev looked at his wife in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Raisa said carefully, "that maybe it's time to let it unravel. Maybe the division of Europe, the Cold War, the whole structure of East versus West, maybe it's all obsolete. Maybe it's time for something new." Gorbachev was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "You sound like Yakovlev, or like Reagan, for that matter." "Maybe they're right," Raisa said. "Maybe the old system can't be reformed. Maybe it needs to be replaced." "But replaced with what?" Gorbachev asked. "Capitalism. American-style democracy. That's not what I want for the Soviet Union. That's not what I've spent my life working for." "I'm not saying we should become like America," Raisa said. "I'm saying we should become something new, something that combines the best of both systems. Democratic socialism, perhaps. A market economy with social protections, political freedom with social justice. Isn't that what you're trying to achieve with glasnost and perestroika?" "Yes," Gorbachev admitted. "But I'm trying to achieve it gradually, carefully, without destroying everything in the process. Reagan wants me to tear down the wall tomorrow. But if I do that, if I move that fast, the whole system could collapse, and then we'd have chaos, not reform." Raisa reached across the table and took his hand. "I understand, Misha, but be prepared for the possibility that events may move faster than you want. Once you start the process of change, it takes on a life of its own. You may not be able to control the pace." Her words echoed what Chernyov had said earlier, and Gorbachev felt a chill of apprehension. What if they were right? What if his reforms were setting in motion forces he couldn't control? What if trying to save communism would actually destroy it? In the weeks and months that followed Reagan's Berlin speech, Gorbachev continued his reform efforts. He pushed for greater glasnost, allowing more open discussion of Soviet history and current problems. He negotiated with Reagan on arms control, eventually signing the INF Treaty in December 1987, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. He began reducing Soviet military presence in Eastern Europe, signaling that the Soviet Union would no longer automatically intervene to prop up communist regimes. But he resisted calls to tear down the Berlin Wall. That, he believed, was a step too far, a change too radical, a concession too great. And yet, Chernyaev and Raisa had been right. Events were moving faster than Gorbachev expected or wanted. His reforms were unleashing forces he couldn't control. In Poland, the Solidarity movement was gaining strength, challenging communist rule. In Hungary, reformers were opening the border with Austria, allowing East Germans to escape to the west through Hungary. Throughout Eastern Europe, people were demanding change, emboldened by Gorbachev's glasnost and by his signals that the Soviet Union would no longer use force to maintain communist regimes. By the summer of 1989, just 2 years after Reagan's Berlin speech, the situation was spiraling beyond Gorbachev's control. East Germans were fleeing by the thousands through Hungary. Protests were erupting in Leipzig and other East German cities. The East German government was paralyzed, unsure whether they could count on Soviet support if they cracked down on protesters. And Gorbachev, true to his reformist principles, told the East German leadership that Soviet troops would not intervene. Each country had to find its own path, he said. The era of Soviet military intervention in Eastern Europe was over. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Not because Gorbachev ordered it torn down, but because East German officials, confused by rapidly changing policies and overwhelmed by public pressure, announced that East Germans could travel freely to the west. Thousands of Berliners, east and west, converged on the wall. Guards, receiving no orders to stop them, opened the gates. People climbed on top of the wall, dancing and celebrating. Others began chipping away at it with hammers and chisels, taking pieces as souvenirs. The images went around the world, the wall coming down, Germans reuniting after 28 years of separation, the most visible symbol of the Cold War crumbling before everyone's eyes. Gorbachev watched it happen from Moscow with mixed feelings. On one hand, he was proud that the change had happened peacefully, without Soviet tanks crushing protesters as they had in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. This was reform, not repression. This was the new Soviet approach. On the other hand, he knew what it meant. The fall of the Berlin Wall would lead to the reunification of Germany, the collapse of communist regimes throughout Eastern Europe, the end of the Warsaw Pact, the dissolution of the Soviet sphere of influence. Everything that the Soviet Union had fought for in World War II, everything that had defined Soviet security policy for 45 years, was disappearing. And Reagan, who had left office 10 months earlier, was being credited with having predicted it, having demanded it, having challenged Gorbachev to tear down the wall. Years later, after the Soviet Union itself had collapsed in 1991, after Gorbachev had been pushed aside by Boris Yeltsin and the reformers, who wanted to move even faster than Gorbachev, after the Cold War had ended and Russia was struggling to find its place in the post-Soviet world, Gorbachev reflected on Reagan's Berlin speech. In an interview in the mid-1990s, he was asked about that moment when Reagan had challenged him to tear down the wall. At the time, Gorbachev said, I thought Reagan was being simplistic, theatrical, playing to his domestic audience. I thought he didn't understand the complexities of European security, the delicate balance that had kept the peace for 40 years. I thought he was making my job harder, making it more difficult for me to reform the Soviet system gradually and peacefully. He paused. But looking back, I think Reagan understood something important that I was slow to grasp. He understood that the Berlin Wall wasn't just a security arrangement or a political boundary. It was a moral obscenity. It was a symbol of everything wrong with the communist system, and as long as it stood, as long as we needed walls and guards and barbed wire to keep our own people from leaving, we could never claim moral legitimacy. So is Reagan right to demand that you tear it down? The interviewer asked. Gorbachev smiled ruefully. Reagan was right that the wall needed to come down, but he was wrong to think I could just order it done. Like turning off a light switch, the wall came down when it did because of a complex set of circumstances. My reforms, the pressure from below in Eastern Europe, the economic failures of the communist system, the decision not to use force to maintain control. Reagan's speech was part of that, but only part. Do you regret not tearing it down earlier, when Reagan challenged you? No, Gorbachev said firmly. If I had tried to tear it down in 1987, the hardliners would have removed me, and all the reforms would have stopped. The wall came down when the time was right, when the political conditions allowed it. 2 years after Reagan's speech, not immediately. But, he added thoughtfully, I do sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had been bolder, if I had moved faster, if I had been willing to accept the collapse of the old system rather than trying to reform it. Maybe the transition would have been smoother. Maybe the Soviet Union itself wouldn't have collapsed. Or maybe it would have been worse, more chaotic, more violent. History doesn't reveal its alternatives. Back in his Kremlin office on that day in June 1987, watching Reagan's speech on the grainy television feed, Gorbachev couldn't know any of this. He couldn't know that the wall would fall in just 2 years. He couldn't know that the Soviet Union itself would collapse in 4 years. He couldn't know that he would be remembered as the man who ended the Cold War, but also as the man who lost the Soviet Empire. All he knew was that an American president was challenging him, demanding that he tear down a wall that had stood for 26 years, that had become a symbol of the Cold War divide, that represented both Soviet security concerns and Soviet moral failure. And Gorbachev, sitting in his office, staring at the television screen, thought to himself, "Not yet, Mr. Reagan. Not yet, but someday. When the time is right. When the conditions allow it, when we can do it in a way that doesn't destroy everything we've built." But even as he thought this, part of him, the part that listened to Yakovlev and Chernyaev and Raisa, the part that understood how rotten the old system was, the part that knew reform might not be enough, that part of him whispered, maybe Reagan is right. Maybe the wall should come down. Maybe it's time to stop defending the indefensible and start building something new. It was that internal conflict between the communist who wanted to save the system and the reformer who knew it might be beyond saving that defined Gorbachev's leadership and ultimately determined the fate of the Soviet Union. Reagan had demanded, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And Gorbachev had thought, not because you demand it, but perhaps because it's right. Perhaps because it's time. Perhaps because walls built to keep people imprisoned are walls that shouldn't exist. 2 years later, the wall fell, and the world changed forever.